back in the book of Psalms. We're going to chip away a little bit more at this chapter. We've got Psalms chapter 78 is where we're at, right? And we're going to see a little bit about how much further we can get. We've been taking our time. There's a lot of stuff in this psalm. It gives a lot of history. But again, I think keep in mind, part of the way that the psalm opens, just to give you a little bit of a refresher here, right? Part of the way that the psalm opens is talking about the fact that the Lord is going to speak to us and He's going to reveal things to us. He even talks about how He may do it in a parable form, right? And we saw that while He was here in the ministry here on this earth, where He spoke to them in parables, right? He was uttering dark sayings of old. But it goes on to talk about how that those things that need to be shared with our children to reflect who God is, what God is, His character. And it really starts to talk about how that we need to be teaching those things to our kids, that we want them to see it, right? This chapter really deals with one generation being told with the intent that they tell the next generation and the next generation, so that the generations that's not even born yet will be told, right? And you see a lot of that here. And oftentimes when we think about that, we think about the positive stories, right? We think about how they parted the Red Sea, and we think about how that the Lord blessed with some of the prophets and some of the things that were done, and how the Lord delivered David whenever it didn't look like it could be possible. And those are good things, and we're told in multiple places in the Bible we should be sharing those things. But to some degree, a lot of this chapter, and it's a long chapter, it is actually dealing with how their fathers saw God's mighty works and yet still rebelled. And it covers a lot of God did A, B, and C, and yet their heart wasn't with Him. And they suffered judgment. And then they turned to God. And then they rejected Him again. Even though they had seen His power and His deliverance time and time and time again. And it really comes down to two things. A rebellious heart. We are told that they were a people of a rebellious heart, right? It also comes down to a lack of faith. And I couldn't help but think about this psalm as we sang the song today, Have Faith in God, right? And the chorus goes, have faith in God, He's on His throne. Have faith in God, He watches o'er His own. He cannot fail, He must prevail. Have faith in God. And what we often see, right, is that's what happened. That's why they were rebellious. That's why they didn't do what they were supposed to do, because they didn't believe God could or that He would. Matter of fact, last time we talked about before they were going to go into the promised land, right? And the spies came back and they told about how great it was. And yet, what happened? Oh, there's giants in the land. Oh, we can't win. Wait a second. A people that had just left one of the mightiest nations in the world at the time, who had seen the plagues that God had sent on that land, who had seen the Red Sea parted, had seen the Egyptians swallowed up in the Red Sea, had seen God produce manna from heaven, had seen God produce water from a rock, had seen this pillar of fire and this cloud by day, had seen so many things that God had done, and yet standing on the precipice of right there at the foot of the promised land, oh wait, this is too hard. God can't do this. Right? And we need to be careful because, listen, we can be like that sometimes. God has done stuff for us and delivered us from stuff and brought us through some really hard times and really hard trials. And we're really encouraged when we look back on what He's done. And yet then we are so many times, the next time a trial comes, we're all down in the dumps and we just don't know how this is going to work. I don't know. Maybe God's not with me anymore. right? And you see that in the Psalms. The Psalms, sometimes you see that attitude, right? But that's not the way we're supposed to be. And we want to make sure that we tell our children the things that God has done to help us, the things that God has done. His character, His being, His ways, His deliverance, right? All of those things are things that we need to make sure that we're sharing with our kids. Our kids also need to know what happens when you don't do it God's way, right? When you don't follow God, what happens? And we talked about a lot of that last time. Now we're going to pick up today in verse 17. Psalms chapter 78, verse 17. It says, "And they sinned yet more against him by provoking the Most High in the wilderness." They sinned and provoked him. And you'll see as we go through this, it's not just that they don't know what God is going to do, but they start to say, well, he did this, but he can't do this. Or why did he do this, right? And they provoke him to anger. You look in verse 18. "And they tempted God in their heart by asking meat for their lust." In other words, the things that God had given them, which were a miracle, were not good enough. And the Bible describes it that they wanted it because they lusted after it. God was taking them to the promised land. He was taking them to the promised land. And yet, the manna from heaven, I've had it too much, I'm tired of it, I want something else. This isn't good enough. It says in verse 19, "Yea, they spake against God." And here's where they start to provoke him. Because listen to what happens. "Yea, they spake against God. They said, Can God furnish a table in the wilderness?" Question mark, right? Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? "Behold, he smote the rock that the waters gushed out, and the streams overflowed. Can he give bread also? Can he provide flesh for his people?" Both of those verses are the words of the people. Now, if those are honest questions, that's one thing, right? But they are taunting God. You imagine here, they've had water, they've had bread from heaven, but what they want is some meat. They're not vegetarian. They want some meat. And so it's almost like instead of just asking God, you know what? We're so thankful for this manna. If it's your will, man, we'd love to have a goose. We'd love to have some meat. But that's not what they did. What they did was they took actual things of God, actual miracles of God, and they said, well, God could do this, but I guess he can't do this. They were taunting him. Hey, God gave us bread from heaven. God gave us water from the rock. But you know what he can't do? He can't give us meat to eat. And back in Egypt, we had meat. Why don't we just go back? That's not just disobedience. But they are, in essence, dishonoring him, doubting him, and taunting him. And these are people that have been delivered. These are people that have seen God do amazing things. But they want more and more. And they doubt and they complain and they murmur. It goes on here and says in verse 21, "Therefore the Lord heard this and was wroth. So a fire was kindled against Jacob, and anger also came up against Israel, because they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation." You see, that's really what it comes down to, right there. Because they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation. And then it goes on and says, though he had commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven, and had rained down manna upon them to eat, and had given them corn of heaven. Man did eat angels' food. He sent them meat to the full. He caused an east wind to blow in the heaven, and his power he brought in the south wind. He rained flesh also upon them as dust, and feathered fowls like as the land of the sea. And he let it fall in the midst of their camp, round about their habitations. So they did eat and were well filled, for he gave them their own desire. They were not estranged from their lust, but while their meat was yet in their mouths, the wrath of God came upon them and slew the fattest of them, and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still and believed not for his wondrous works. So we read these stories, right? And the psalmist does a good job of drawing out the fact that the issue was they didn't trust God, they didn't believe God, they didn't think the things that God had given them were good enough. The psalmist describes the fact that they literally had bread falling from heaven. And it describes it as angels' food. And yet that wasn't good enough. The fact that there's this miracle and every day we have food to eat, like 600,000 men alone or something like that. I mean, we're talking about a massive amount of people. And yet every day in the wilderness, they're fed. And yet they can say, well, God can do that, but he can't do this. And God hears it, and God gets angry, and God actually gives them what they wanted. God gave them what they wanted. He gave them meat to eat. And the Bible describes it as they were not estranged from their lust. In other words, the thing they lusted after was not withheld from them. Estranged means to be separated from, right? They weren't estranged from their lust. They got what they wanted. But with a disobedient heart, an unbelieving heart, a distrusting heart, and in the end, as they consumed it, God, knowing their heart, sent judgment. And many of them died. It says literally, while they were still chewing it, God sent condemnation. We can actually turn over and we'll read this story. If you take your Bibles, turn to the book of Numbers. And there's going to be a lot of reading here, but again, just to remind us of this story. There's been a lot of stuff that's going on. And if you look at verse 11, or chapter 11, well, we'll back up. Chapter 10, the end of chapter 10. It says in verse 33, and they departed from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them in the 3 days' journey to search out a resting place for them. And the cloud of the Lord was upon them by day when they went out of the camp. And it came to pass, when the ark set forward, that Moses said, Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee from before thee. And when it rested, he said, Return, O Lord, unto the many thousands of Israel. And the people, in verse 1, chapter 11, and the people complained. By the way, you should take from the end of chapter 3 that the Lord was with them, and the Lord was blessing them, and the Lord was going to protect them, and he was going to scatter their enemies. And then chapter 11 starts with the words, and when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and it consumed them. They were in the uttermost parts of the camp. You understand here that, like, they started complaining, they started murmuring, and the Lord sent fire among the outer parts of the camp, and he consumed some of them. I mean, it was judgment. Verse 2. And the people cried unto Moses, and when Moses prayed unto the Lord, the fire was quenched. And he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. And the children of Israel also wept again, and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? You understand that, like, victory, complaining, judgment, repentance, first trial, complaining, God can't do this, judgment. It's a cycle with these people. But you see here in verse 5, and again, understand where I'm saying that they were like taunting God almost. It says in verse 5, we remember the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely. Oh, I'm not sure people that were in Egypt should ever use the word freely. They were in bondage. Sure. Did they have food to eat? Yes. They were also slaves. There's examples of them being beaten. There's example of them, their labor being increased. Their children were killed. And yet what they remember of Egypt is, do you remember how we got to eat fish? Man, all we have now is this stupid bread from heaven. Like, I'm so tired of this bread from heaven stuff. Like, where's the fish? Give me some fish. I don't know what's wrong with them, because I don't like fish to begin with. But we did eat it in Egypt freely. The cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. You can almost, look, okay, I don't know. You read that verse blandly, I think you're misreading it. You have to read that verse with longing in your voice, right? Man, they are just thinking back, and you can almost like the cartoons, right? Where like the little bubble shows up above their heads, and they got their tongue sticking out, and they're kind of licking their lips. Man, I remember the fish and the cucumbers and the melons. It's so much better than this manna stuff. Ugh. But, Egypt. We had it made back then, didn't we, guys? Egypt. Verse 6, but now our soul is dried away, and there's nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. And the manna was as coriander seed, and the color thereof is the color of bedlam. And the people went about and gathered it and ground it in mills, or beat it in a mortar and baked it in pans and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was as the taste of fresh oil. And when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. Then Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. And Moses also was displeased. And Moses said unto the Lord, wherefore hast thou affected thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Like, poor Moses, man. It's like he leads, and every turn they're complaining. Why did we even come with you? Why did God bring us out here? He's just going to bring us out here to die. And even Moses at this point says, Lord, if I found favor in your sight, why did you burden me with these people? Like, why do I got to be the guy to lead these people? Bunch of complainers. Listen, it's no fun. It's no fun to try to lead complaining, drama-filled people. It's not fun. And Moses had a whole nation of them. It says in verse 12, have I conceived all this people? Did I have begot them, that thou shouldest say unto me, carry them in thy bosom as a nursing father, bearing the sucking child unto the land which thou swearest unto their fathers? I'm not sure, like, I don't know, honestly, that Moses was in the best place right now either, right? Lord, were they born? They ain't my kids by nature. Like, I didn't have these kids. Yet, why do you tell me I got to carry them around like a father or mother bearing a suckling child? Verse 13, whence should I have flesh to come unto all this people? For they weep unto me, saying, give us flesh that we may eat. He says, how many people do I have? And they're begging me for meat. How am I going to do that? the Bible doesn't really say anything here, but like to me, that statement in and of itself is kind of a, even in Moses, is a reflection of maybe a lack of trust here. He says, I'm not able to bear all this people alone because it is too heavy for me. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. Just, Lord, kill me. Just put me out of my misery before I see how wretched I am. Like, just be done with me before I do something that I wish I hadn't done. And with that, something fell. It says in verse 16, And the Lord said unto Moses, Gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom thou knowest to be the elders of the people and the officers over them, and bring them unto the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with thee. And I will come down and talk with thee there, and I will take of the Spirit which is upon thee, and I will put it upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with thee, that thou bear it not thyself alone. Now here, this is a little bit like we've got stories sandwiched between stories, right? Complaining and rebellion, judgment, forgiveness, complaining and rebellion, even down to the leader saying, I need help, I can't do this on my own. Now, the Lord is merciful, I think, here to Moses, and what he does is he says, well, I'll help you. You go gather 70 elders, and I am going to put on them some of the same gifts that I have given you. Okay? It says in verse 18, And thou say unto the people, Sanctify yourself against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh, for ye have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, Who shall give us flesh to eat? For it is well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and ye shall eat it. Ye shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, until it come out of your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, Why came we forth out of Egypt? Now the Lord says, okay, Moses, I'm going to help you. Go get 70 elders. We're going to take care of that. But listen, I also want you to tell the people they need to sanctify themselves, because starting tomorrow, I am going to send them meat like they ask for. And they are going to be able to eat, that meat that they have been desiring. And not just for 1 day, and not 2 days, and not 5 days, not 10 days, not 20 days, but an entire month. And I'm going to give you so much of it, you're going to feel like it's coming out your nose. You're going to be so full of it. You're going to feel like it's just coming out your nose. And you're going to be sick of it. But it's what you want. But let me tell you what, by the time you're done, you're going to be wishing you just had manna from heaven. And Moses said, The people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen, and thou hast said, I will give them flesh they may eat a whole month. Do you again kind of see, even in Moses, like this hesitation? Lord, there are 600,000 footmen, and you're telling me you're going to have meat for a whole month for all of them. And he says, Shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them to suffice them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to suffice them? Have you ever thought how much it took to feed that many people? Think about it. You know what? We went from having 4 people to 8 people in our house. You know what? It takes a lot of food to feed 8 people. You know what? We're also trying to do some more non-gluten stuff, and which means more regular cooking and not just buying stuff, that you throw in the freezer and cook later. That's a lot of work. Just ask Tanya. I don't know. I just watch her. But you know what it's done? It's made me think, like, okay, if we didn't have Walmart and Dollar General just down the road, how much work would it be to feed 8 people? Not 1 day, not 2 days, not 10 days, not 20 days. Even just a month, how much effort would it take to feed 8 people? A balanced meal, right? You got your breads, you got your fruits, you got your vegetables, you got your meat. Now try to imagine what it would take to feed just 600,000 men. That's not counting the women and the children and the livestock. As you're traveling through one area to another area to get to the promised land. And so you can almost imagine Moses' shock, like from a worldly perspective, makes sense. Like, how are you going to do that, God? Are we going to kill every cow and every lamb and every goat and every animal we have? Like, I think he's almost even saying, I don't even think killing all of those would feed us for a month. It says verse 23, and the Lord said unto Moses, is the Lord's hand waxed short? Thou shalt see now whether my word shall come to pass unto thee or not. God's answer back to Moses was, is the power of my hand waxed short? Do you think I can't do this, Moses? In essence, don't you remember the power of like even a little finger? What did I do to the Egyptians, Moses? What have I done for you guys already? And you think I can't do this? My power's not waxed short. Let's just see who's right. Let's see if my word or your word comes to pass. In verse 24, and Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord, and gathered the 70 men of the elders of the people, and set them round about the tabernacle. And the Lord came down in a cloud, and spake unto him, and took of the Spirit that it was upon him, and gave it unto the 70 elders. And it came to pass that when the Spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, and did not cease. But there remained 2 of the men in the camp. The name of the one was Eldad, and the name of the other was Medad. And the Spirit rested upon them, and they were of them that were written, but went not out unto the tabernacle, and they prophesied in the camp. And there ran a young man and told Moses and said, Eldad and Medad do prophesy in the camp. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of Moses, one of his young men, answered and said, my lord Moses, forbid them. And Moses said unto him, enviest thou for my sake? Would God that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his Spirit upon them. And Moses got him into the camp, he and the elders of Israel. So the Lord gives these 70 people, he puts his Spirit upon them, they start to prophesy. There's 2 people that are actually in the camp prophesying, and Moses is told about it. Joshua he's all riled up about it, and Moses, we need to tell them to stop. You're the leader. And Moses is like, I wish everybody had the Spirit of God upon them. I wish everybody could prophesy. Like, I'm not worried about those 2 guys. Matter of fact, I think Moses probably saw some help here. There's somebody else that has some responsibility to carry now. It says in verse 31, and there went forth a wind from the Lord, which is what Psalms talked about, by the way. And there went forth a wind from the Lord, and brought quail from the sea, and let them fall upon the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. Now, just think about that for a minute. How big of an area would it take to have 600,000 men, plus their wives and children and everything else? We're not talking about a little area, right? I mean, you've been to a baseball stadium, like a professional baseball stadium? Like, those things don't even hold 100,000 people, right? I mean, we're talking a lot of people. Not just to sit and watch a game for a few hours, but to live. And yet, amongst them and all around about them, enough quail that, was it 2 cubits? I think it said 2 cubits. There's all this debate about how big a cubit is, right? But let's say a cubit is 18 inches, 12 inches, 18 inches, times 2. You know, we're talking this high. And what happened? For a day's journey that way, and a day's journey that way, and a day's journey that way, and a day's journey that way, there were dead quail everywhere. Dead birds everywhere. And to some degree at first, it must have seemed like a dream come true. Meat. We get to go pluck that thing, and we get to go stick it on a spike and stick it over a fire, slap some stuff on it. Front row's getting hungry, licking his chops. But remember, God had said, I'm going to give you so much of it that by the time a month is done, you are going to feel like the stuff is coming out your nose, and you're going to despise it. It says in verse 32, and the people stood up all that day and all that night and all the next day, and they gathered the quail. He that gathered least gathered 10 omers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp. It says that the people stood up that day and all night and all the next day. In other words, like 2 full days, working night and day. They went out and they gathered quail. And I don't know what all they're doing to it. Gathering it, plucking it. Maybe they're smoking it so it doesn't go bad tomorrow. I don't know what they're doing to it. But for 2 days they work on this. And then it says in verse 33, and while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people. And the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. And he called the name of that place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people that lusted. They complained. God sent fire among them. They repented. God blessed them. They started complaining. They started taunting God. They started saying God couldn't do it. God can't do this. God can't do that. We want meat. Why didn't we just stay in Egypt? I mean, how much of a slap in the face to God is that statement? They were in slavery, in bondage, pleading with God to deliver them. And yet when he did, everything he gave them wasn't good enough. And they just said, you might as well just send us back. God, Egypt took care of us better than you do. And yet, when the quail show up, at least in this passage, do you see any reference to, wow, this is amazing. We were so wrong. Look at what God did. Nope. You see no indication of that. They just spent the next 2 days gathering meat and just looking forward to being able to consume it upon their own lust. And as they were consuming it, God said, you got what you wanted, but now you have to suffer the judgment. The judgment that comes with unbelief and disobedience. And the Lord, we're told here and we're told in Psalms, that the fattest and some of the strongest were killed. The greediest, those that were the most consumed with what they could have, those that were probably the mightiest, the ones that were the most able through their own strength to accomplish something, those are actually the ones that the Lord killed. Complete, total lack of obedience and a complete and total lack of faith and trust in the Lord. For a people who had already seen miracle after miracle. You know what? I've never seen the water parted. Have you? Have you ever seen an entire sea part and the ground be dry and you could walk across it? First thing I think about is to get to see all those shipwrecks or all those things that are under the ocean. I always wonder what's down there. Or maybe a little fish flopping around because he didn't quite, I don't know, right? But listen, that would be amazing. Right? Now imagine that you had not just heard about it, but you were actually standing there watching it happen. Or to see a river created because the rock was hit. Or to look up in the morning and find that bread just appeared on the ground from heaven. And you live that every day. You saw the land full of frogs and locusts and the water turned to blood. You have seen this stuff with your own eyes. And yet in all of it, you were kept safe. You didn't have to deal with the locusts, and you didn't have to deal with the bloody water, and you didn't have to lose your firstborn. And yet, at every trial you come across, you say, God must not love us. God must not care. God can't take care of us. I think you see here what God thinks of those statements. This was a rebellious and stubborn, disobedient, unfaithful generation. One that was destined to not go into the promised land, to not see the benefits of the Lord. But yet their children would do the very things that they said God couldn't help them do. It's stuff like this that this psalm is saying, don't let future generations forget this. That's part of his point in Psalm 78, is don't let your children's children forget what happened here. We need to be speaking of the things of God, the character of God, the ways of God, God's deliverance, what he's done for us. We need to be sharing those things with our kids. You know what your kids also need to know? Your kids need to know the repercussions of the things that you have done wrong. The repercussions of maybe what your forefathers have done that didn't turn out so great because they didn't do what God said. You know, by the way, I think as you look at the New Testament, there's sufficient indication of saying that the generation in Jesus' time was basically compared to this generation. When the Bible says you were like your fathers, you were like this stubborn, hard-hearted, rebellious, unbelieving people that left Egypt. Or you were like the stubborn, rebellious people who refused to hear the words of the prophets when they told you to stop worshiping those false idols. Brother Philip pointed out in Sunday school this morning, the total depravity of man it's a good example when you look at Noah and how the Lord literally hit the reset button. And he wiped out everybody but Noah and his family. And yet, within 500 years, less potentially, was the Tower of Babel, when the people were rebellious in heart and were talking about how they weren't going to do it God's way, but they were going to do it their own way. And they were going to make of themselves some great thing. Matter of fact, even back then, he pointed out that back then people lived longer, which means that Shem, who was Moses' son, would have been alive at the time the Tower of Babel happened. So we know, listen, We can look back and we can go, well, a few generations ago, our fathers were really screwed up and unfaithful and disbelieving. It doesn't take long for that stuff to creep in. Matter of fact, it doesn't even take a whole generation. Talk to your kids about the things of God. His deliverance, His mighty acts, the things He does. Talk about the repercussions of what happens when we don't follow Him, when we don't serve Him. It's just as important for them to know the consequences. They need to know what happens when we don't follow God. Okay. We made it that far. Lord willing, here in the coming weeks, we'll chip away a little bit more at it. But for today, we'll be done. We'll ask Brother Philip to come and lead us in a song.